I told you not to come here. Look what you've done. Get out of my house right now.
The moment my son shouted those words, the room went silent in a way that felt violent, like all the air had been ripped out at once, and every smiling face around my grandson's first birthday cake froze mid-breath. If you enjoy slow-burning family drama, where respect is tested and consequences arrive right on time, make sure you subscribe now, because stories like this always reveal the truth in the end. I am Luna, and that day, standing in my son James's living room, with pastel balloons brushing the ceiling and sugary frosting thick in the air, I realized I was no longer seen as a mother, but as an obstacle. The music was still playing softly, a cheerful tune meant for a baby who had no idea his birthday would become the line that split our family in two. James's voice had been sharp, louder than the laughter, louder than the clinking of plates, louder than my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Mom, apologize to my mother-in-law, or get out of my house." The words echoed, ugly and final. I looked at the woman standing beside him, his wife's mother, perfectly dressed in ivory, lips curved into a small, satisfied smirk that told me she had been waiting for this moment. She didn't look surprised. She looked victorious. Just minutes earlier, she had corrected the way I held my grandson, whispered that my gift was impractical, and laughed when I mentioned a family tradition James once loved. Each comment had been wrapped in politeness, sharp underneath, meant to cut without drawing blood. I had stayed quiet for the sake of the day, for the sake of the child with wide eyes and cake smeared on his fingers. But when James chose to raise his voice at me, when he chose to make a public demand instead of a private conversation, something inside me settled into a calm that surprised even me. I stood up slowly, smoothing my coat, feeling every year of my life in my spine and every lesson I had learned in my bones. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked directly into my son's eyes first, searching for the boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knees. I didn't find him. Then I turned to her. She met my gaze without flinching, chin lifted, eyes glittering with triumph, as if she had already written the ending to this story in her head. I said only 3 words. They were quiet, steady, and final. "You've made it." No one understood what I meant then. I picked up my purse, ignored the stunned faces, and walked out past the balloons, past the cake, past the life I thought I still had access to. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt louder than James's shout. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and memories, my hands steady on the wheel, my thoughts painfully clear. I did not call anyone. I did not replay the argument out loud. I let the silence sit with me, heavy and honest. At home, I made tea, the same way I had for decades, and stared out the window as the sun went down. I knew something James did not. I had never been dependent on him. I had planned my life carefully, quietly, without fanfare. I had given generously when I was welcomed, and I had stepped back when I was not. Over the next 2 weeks, I did nothing dramatic. I didn't post online. I didn't send messages. I didn't defend myself to relatives. I simply withdrew. I canceled the regular transfers I had set up years ago to help James with expenses he never mentioned in public. I redirected funds I had earmarked for my grandson's future into an account under my control, as I had always legally been allowed to do. I informed my lawyer, a woman who had known me long enough to read my tone, that certain arrangements might need revisiting. Life went on quietly, predictably, while the space I left behind grew louder in James's world. Bills arrived. Expectations went unmet. The invisible support he had never acknowledged vanished, and with it, the illusion of control he thought he had. On the 15th day after the party, just as I finished watering my plants, there was a frantic knocking at my door. Not a polite tap, not a pause. Desperate, uneven pounding. I knew who it was before I opened it. James stood there, eyes red, shoulders slumped, confidence gone, holding his phone like a lifeline that had failed him. For the first time in a long time, he looked like my son again, scared and unsure. But I also saw the man who had told me to get out. I did not invite him in right away. I let the silence do what words couldn't. He began to speak, apologies tumbling over each other, explanations framed as misunderstandings, regret sharpened by necessity. I listened without interrupting, my face calm, my heart steady. When he finally stopped, waiting for forgiveness like it was something automatic, I spoke carefully, making sure every word landed. I told him that respect was not conditional, that love was not leverage, and that public humiliation had private consequences. I told him that I would always love him, but I would never accept being diminished again. His shoulders shook as he realized this was not a moment he could rewind. This was the ending he had chosen. James stood on my porch like a stranger who had lost his way, and for a moment I wondered if he even remembered how often he used to stand here as a boy, impatiently knocking because he'd forgotten his keys. The difference now was the urgency wasn't playful. It was fear. I stepped aside just enough to let him in, not out of kindness, but because some lessons require a quiet room to fully land. He walked into my living room and looked around as if seeing it for the first time, noticing the careful order, the framed photos, the absence of clutter. This place had always reflected me, prepared, self-contained, steady. He sat when I gestured, hands clasped, eyes darting as though the answers might be written on the walls. He started talking again, filling the silence with words about stress, misunderstandings, pressure from his wife's family, how things had spiraled since the party. I listened without nodding, without correcting him, without offering comfort. When he mentioned his mother-in-law, his tone shifted, defensive and strained, and I saw how deeply entangled he had allowed himself to become. He spoke about finances then, carefully at first, then with growing desperation as he realized I wasn't interrupting to reassure him. He admitted they were behind on payments, that plans had fallen apart, that promises he'd made, assuming my quiet support had not materialized. I let him talk until the truth exhausted him. Then I asked a single question, calmly, almost gently. Did you ever wonder why I stayed silent for 2 weeks? He looked up, confused, and shook his head. I told him silence was not weakness, it was clarity. I explained that for years I had helped without being asked publicly, because I believed family meant stepping in quietly. But family also meant mutual respect, and the moment he chose spectacle over dignity, he forfeited my silent support. His face paled as realization settled in. He tried to argue, to say that the birthday had been stressful, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that his words had been exaggerated by emotion. I reminded him that words spoken in front of others are never exaggerated. They are performed. I told him I would not compete with his wife's mother, nor would I apologize for existing in my grandson's life. He lowered his head, shame creeping into his posture. He asked what he could do now, voice cracking. And for the first time, I saw him as a man facing consequences, rather than a son seeking comfort. I told him there was nothing he could do to undo the moment, but there were choices ahead that would define who he became next. I said I would not resume financial support, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because dependence had blurred his sense of accountability. I told him I would be present in my grandson's life only if I was treated with respect, privately and publicly, without conditions or competitions. He asked about the future, about holidays, birthdays, whether this meant distance. I told him distance was already created the day he raised his voice and pointed to the door. All I had done was acknowledge it. He sat quietly then, absorbing the weight of it all. And I could see the internal struggle as pride wrestled with necessity. When he finally stood to leave, he asked if I still loved him. I answered without hesitation that love had never been the issue. Respect had. After he left, I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't known I was missing. Days passed, and word traveled through the family in fragments. Some relatives reached out, curious, cautious, fishing for details. I kept my responses brief and factual. There was no need to dramatize what spoke for itself. Meanwhile, James's household began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. Without my quiet presence smoothing things over, tensions rose. Decisions that had once been easy became arguments. His wife's mother, used to control without resistance, found herself facing limits for the first time. I didn't need to witness it to know. Patterns repeat when exposed to pressure. One afternoon, I received a message from James's wife, carefully worded, polite to the point of stiffness, inviting me to visit and talk things through. I waited a full day before responding, then declined, not out of spite, but because timing matters. Boundaries mean little if they're flexible at the first sign of discomfort. Instead, I sent a message explaining that conversations should happen when accountability is clear, not when solutions are needed. The silence that followed was telling. Weeks later, on a quiet morning, I took my grandson's photo from the shelf and smiled softly. My love for him was untouched by adult failures. I began making plans for my own life again, reconnecting with friends, traveling, investing time where it was valued. The power I reclaimed wasn't loud. It was steady. And somewhere, I knew James was learning that respect demanded is fragile, but respect earned endures. Time has a way of revealing truths that arguments only hint at. And as the weeks stretched on, I watched from a distance as the consequences James had dismissed began to shape his days. He didn't call as often after that visit, not because things had improved, but because he was struggling to understand a world where I no longer rushed in to soften his mistakes. Mutual friends mentioned seeing him tired, distracted, less sure of himself. I listened without commentary, absorbing the information like weather reports. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, but confirmation. When you remove a silent pillar, the structure shows its cracks. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor who had attended my grandson's birthday. She hesitated before speaking, then admitted she had been shocked by James's outburst. I wanted to say something, she told me, but it wasn't my place. I smiled politely and thanked her, though inside I noted how easily people excuse silence when it's convenient. Still, the truth had been witnessed, and that mattered. A few days later, James called again, his voice quieter, less defensive. He didn't ask for money this time. He asked how I was. The question sounded unfamiliar on his tongue, as if he were trying it out for the first time. I answered honestly, telling him I was well, busy, fulfilled. He seemed surprised, perhaps expecting bitterness or loneliness. We spoke briefly, carefully, like two people learning a new language. When he mentioned his wife's mother, there was no accusation in his voice, only exhaustion. I reminded him gently that alliances built on control rarely last, and that peace purchased by sacrificing others eventually demands payment. He didn't argue. Silence followed, heavy, but thoughtful. As summer edged closer, I received an invitation in the mail to another family gathering. No apology was attached, no acknowledgement of the past, just an assumption that time alone had smoothed everything over. I placed the card on my table and left it there for days. In the end, I didn't attend, not because I wasn't ready, but because readiness without recognition leads to repetition. My absence was noticed. I heard later that James had been asked where I was, that he'd mumbled excuses he didn't fully believe himself. Each question chipped away at the narrative he had allowed to stand. Around this time, I made a decision that surprised even me. I revised my will, not in anger, not in haste, but with clarity. I ensured provisions were made for my grandson in a way that protected his future without enabling the adults around him. I allocated resources toward causes and people who had shown consistent respect, understanding that generosity should follow values, not blood alone, felt empowering, not vengeful. Meanwhile, James's desperation returned in subtler forms. He asked for advice, then ignored it. He sought reassurance, then bristled when it wasn't unconditional. Each interaction taught him, slowly, that the dynamic had changed permanently. One evening, he called late, his voice strained. He admitted that his household felt tense, that nothing seemed stable anymore. I listened, then told him stability built on imbalance always collapses. He asked if I blamed his wife's mother. I told him blame was irrelevant. Responsibility mattered more. He fell quiet again, perhaps realizing that accountability could not be outsourced. As months passed, I felt lighter. The absence of constant accommodation freed me. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped anticipating conflict before it arrived. When I did see James again, unexpectedly at a local store, he looked startled, then relieved. We spoke briefly, cordially. There was no confrontation, no apology, no pretense of normalcy, just acknowledgement. And in that moment, I saw growth beginning, tentative but real. He didn't ask me to fix anything. He didn't demand anything. He simply said he hoped we could rebuild, slowly, on different terms. I told him rebuilding required a new foundation, not patches on the old one. He nodded, absorbing the truth without protest. As I walked away, I felt no need to look back. The power I held now came from knowing my worth without needing it validated. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, steady and undeniable, as life rearranges itself around the boundaries you finally enforce. By the time autumn arrived, the distance between who James had been and who he was becoming had grown visible enough that even he could no longer ignore it. Change didn't come as a grand apology or a sudden act of courage. It arrived quietly, through discomfort. Through nights spent arguing over things that used to be smoothed over by my presence. Through moments when he reached for his phone to call me for help, then remembered the last time he had spoken to me like a problem instead of a parent. One afternoon, he showed up again, not pounding this time, not frantic, but hesitant. He stood on my porch with his hands in his pockets, eyes tired, voice low when I opened the door. He didn't ask to come in. He waited. That pause told me more than any speech could. I invited him inside, and he sat across from me like a guest, not an owner of entitlement. He told me things he had never admitted before. That he felt trapped between expectations. That he had mistaken silence for agreement. That he had allowed someone else's approval to matter more than his own integrity. I didn't interrupt. I let the truth unfold at its own pace. When he finished, He finally said the words he had avoided for months. He said he was sorry, not for the financial strain, not for the inconvenience, but for humiliating me, publicly, deliberately. His voice broke when he admitted that the look on my face that day had haunted him more than any argument since. I accepted the apology without celebration. Forgiveness, I told him, was not a reset button. It was permission to move forward, not backward. He nodded, understanding at last that this was not about regaining what he had lost, but earning something new. As he left that day, he didn't ask for anything, and that was progress. News filtered back to me slowly. His wife's mother no longer visited as often. Her opinions were no longer delivered as commands. Boundaries, once enforced, had a way of reshaping entire households. I didn't interfere. I didn't advise. I simply observed. At a family event months later, I attended for the first time since the birthday. The room felt different when I entered. Conversations paused, then resumed, softer, more careful. James greeted me respectfully, introducing me properly, standing beside me, instead of ahead of me. His wife watched closely, measuring the shift. Her mother kept her distance, polite but restrained. The balance had changed, and everyone felt it. No one raised their voice, no one smirked. The absence of disrespect was loud. I spent time with my grandson that day, laughing as he toddled around, blissfully unaware of the power struggles that had preceded him. When it was time to leave, James walked me to my car. He thanked me for coming. I told him I came for the child, not the performance. He accepted that without argument. That night, alone again, I reflected on the simplicity of it all. I had not plotted revenge. I had not shouted. I had not demanded apologies on my own terms. I had simply stepped away and let reality speak. And reality had been far harsher than anything I could have said in anger. The woman who had smirked that day no longer looked victorious. The son who had shouted now chose his words carefully. And I, who had been told to leave, had returned only on my own terms. That was the revenge. Not destruction, but reordering. Not humiliation, but consequence. I slept peacefully, knowing that the lesson would outlast the moment, and that respect, once lost and painfully relearned, would never again be taken for granted. Winter settled in quietly, and with it came a clarity that only distance and time can provide. I noticed how my phone rang less often, but when it did, the conversations were intentional, not transactional. James no longer called to unload problems or seek instant solutions. He asked questions now, and more importantly, he waited for answers instead of interrupting them. That shift told me everything. One evening, he called to tell me he had finally confronted what he'd avoided for years. He admitted that allowing his wife's mother to dominate decisions had been easier than standing firm, and that throwing me under the bus at the birthday had been an attempt to prove loyalty where it was demanded most aggressively. Hearing this didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought closure. I told him courage delayed often shows up as regret first, and that regret, if listened to, can still teach. Around the same time, subtle changes rippled through the family. Invitations came with genuine warmth instead of obligation. Conversations included me instead of circling around me. When disagreements surfaced, my presence was no longer used as leverage. I had become neutral ground, respected because I no longer needed approval. The woman who once smirked avoided direct interaction, her power diminished by the fact that I no longer reacted. Control thrives on response, and I had given her none. The most revealing moment came unexpectedly. At another small gathering, someone joked about the infamous birthday, framing it lightly, as if time had softened it into humor. The room went still. Before I could speak, James corrected them, calmly, firmly. He said it wasn't funny, that he had been wrong, and that he was grateful I had shown him the cost of disrespect without ever raising my voice. In that instant, I understood the full arc of what had happened. My silence had done what arguments never could. After that, things changed decisively. I was consulted, not commanded, included, not tolerated. And when I declined, it was accepted without resentment. My grandson grew, learning my presence as something steady and joyful, untouched by the tension that once surrounded it. I invested my time where it was reciprocated, my energy where it was appreciated. The revenge everyone expects is loud, explosive, cruel. But the revenge that lasts is dignified. It forces others to sit with their choices long enough to understand them. The day I was told to apologize or leave had stripped away illusions. The weeks that followed rebuilt reality. I had not lost my son. I had reclaimed myself. And in doing so, I taught him a lesson no lecture could deliver. That love without respect is fragile, but respect born from consequence is unbreakable. The final proof that everything had truly changed came on a quiet evening I hadn't planned for. James arrived without warning, not with panic, not with excuses, but with something far heavier in his hands than desperation. He brought accountability. He sat across from me and told me that the story of that birthday had followed him everywhere. Friends, relatives, even coworkers who had heard fragments of it no longer saw him as the confident man in control. They saw the cracks, and for the first time, he didn't try to defend himself. He admitted that the humiliation he'd inflicted on me had cost him more than money, more than comfort. It had cost him credibility. He told me his marriage had nearly fractured under the weight of unspoken power struggles, that the woman who once smirked now blamed him for not protecting her dominance, and that choosing sides had finally forced him to confront his own weakness. I listened, calm and steady, because this was no longer my burden to carry. He asked what finally broke me that day, what made me stand up and leave without arguing. I told him the truth, that I realized in that moment. I was being asked to shrink so others could feel tall, and I refused. That the 3 words I spoke weren't a threat or a plan, but a recognition that they had already chosen a world where I no longer fit. And instead of begging for space in it, I built my own. He nodded slowly, as if each word settled into a place he'd avoided looking at before. He apologized again, not seeking forgiveness this time, but offering remorse without expectation. That difference mattered. I told him our relationship would continue, but it would never return to what it had been. It would be better, or it would be distant. Those were the only options now. He accepted that without protest. Months later, on my grandson's next birthday, I attended by invitation, not obligation. The celebration was smaller, quieter, stripped of performances meant to impress. When James stood to speak, he thanked everyone, then turned to me. He acknowledged my presence, my role, my importance, without theatrics. No one interrupted. No one smirked. The woman who once believed she'd won sat silently, her influence reduced to nothing more than a chair at the table. I watched my grandson laugh, felt his small hand in mine, and understood the full weight of what had happened. I hadn't destroyed a family. I had recalibrated it. I hadn't sought revenge in the way people expect. I let consequences do the work. I let absence speak. I let dignity become undeniable. The son who once yelled now chose his words carefully. The house I was told to leave no longer felt like a place I needed permission to enter. And I, Luna, stood exactly where I belonged. Not above anyone, not beneath anyone, just unmovable. That was the ending they never anticipated.